Basil. Basil.
Basil. Basil. Basil.
Literally, my favorite herb that I simply can't get enough of. I can eat it by the bucket load, and I try to find a way to use it in every dish. Buying it freshly cut in the grocery store is enough to make any basil aficionado quite sad. And buying plants several times a year, when available, can get pretty pricey. Fortunately, basil is just too darn easy to propagate, both from seed and from cuttings, so our path to unlimited basil nirvana is just around the corner. Basil is a member of the mint family with origins in the tropical regions of Central Africa to Southeast Asia. For most of us, it's grown as an annual, which means for the basil addicted, like me, a constant year-round supply could be a challenge. Temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit can be fatal for the plants, with the optimal range of basil being 80 to 90 degrees. And so whether you have to grow your basil indoors or you're able to grow it outside will be entirely predicated on the range of temperatures that you can provide. Basil is a plant that enjoys a rich, well-drained but moist, organic heavy potting mix. One of the worst things that you can do for these guys is to overwater them. More than any other plant that I've seen, basil simply hates wet feet. So make sure that the soil as well as the container drain well. A pH of 6 to 7 is ideal, and try to give basil as much light as possible. Air circulation is great and even necessary at times, but try to avoid excessive wind, especially if you're growing outdoors. While basil is relatively easy to grow when you observe these parameters, it's even easier to propagate. There's 2 ways to do it, so let's dive right in. The most common way to get started with basil is to plant it from seeds. They're relatively cheap, and quite a few different varieties are available. My favorite is always the standard sweet basil, both for performance and flavor. Whatever variety or seeds you end up choosing, the steps to planting these guys is all the same. Start out with a quality organic potting mix designed for seeds. These soils are usually lighter, fluffier, and provide the perfect environment for the seeds to germinate and the young plants to get growing. Just use some small pots for a few plants, or professional plug trays if you're growing many. Before actually seeding, I do like to pre-soak my soil from below for best results. And there's 2 reasons. Watering from above directly after you've seeded blasts the soil and possibly the seeds everywhere. Not good. As well, when you water from below, you know that soil has taken up as much water as it possibly can. Which is great, because knowing that your soil is holding on to as much moisture as possible means that you don't have to water again until after the seeds germinate. Plant 2 to 3 of the tiny basil seeds per cell, or per pot, at around a ½ inch deep. Keep them at a stable 80 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, preferably covering them with a clear dome or even some plastic. The seeds are going to sprout within a week, and they'll get their first set of true leaves another week after that. Give them lots of light as much as you can and a moderate amount of airflow. Basil grows best as a bushy plant with about 2 to 3 main stalks. Which is funny because you'll see the store-bought basil plants with about 100 of them. Once your young plants have about 3 to 4 sets of true leaves, you can go ahead and either plant them in the garden or a larger pot. Basil does transplant fairly well, but you're going to want to make sure that it does have an adequate root system. Once your plants reach about 4 to 6 inches tall, you can go ahead and pinch off that top node. And while getting an early quick harvest is nice, the main reason for this is you want the basil plant to bush out. By removing that leader shoot, you're going to cause the top 2 nodes to branch out with 2 more nodes of their own. You see, with basil, The more you harvest, the bigger the plant becomes. Every time you take off one of those top shoots, 2 more are going to replace it. Amazing. Basil is best eaten before the flowering stage, and you can actually delay this by harvesting the tops. So these early prunings actually do 3 things for us. 1, you get an early harvest, which is awesome because you're probably itching to get some basil. 2, they cause the plant to naturally bush out, giving you a much bigger basil plant in the long run, thus giving you more harvests. And 3, it encourages the plant to stay in a vegetative growth state rather than flowering. Because once the basil plant flowers, it's coming to the end of its life cycle. Which brings us to the second way of propagating basil, and that's cuttings. Recently, a friend of mine gave me one of those store-bought basil plants as a gift. It was kind of amusing, them not knowing what I actually do for a living, and the fact that at any given time, 12 months of the year, I'm actually swimming in basil. Kind of humorous, but still, a nice thought. What better way, though, to pay it forward than to take this one $5 plant, make many, many more basil plants as gifts, and show you guys the cutting propagation method in the process. For growing basil from cuttings, you'll need 4 things. A glass jar, some water, a pair of clean scissors, and an adult basil plant. Now, taking basil cuttings always works best on mature plants that have not yet started to flower. Because like we mentioned, leaves on the stalks of flowering basil plants don't taste nearly as good as those on younger stems. And further to that, you'll find that flowering basil stem cuttings are far more difficult to initiate rooting. Which is perfect, because we can then go ahead and prune our basil for increased growth while simultaneously collecting the stalks for cuttings. Try to cut your stem sections around 4 to 6 inches long with at least 2 to 3 leaf nodes. Some people recommend cutting at an angle and right below a node, but honestly, these guys root so easily, it's not even necessary. Take off all the leaves except the top whorl, and you've just set up the stem to become a root-producing factory. Now, you can plant them directly into moist soil, but if you're like me and you want to make sure that the cutting takes before dedicating soil to the cause, then you're likely going to be rooting these guys in water. Like we said, take off all those lower leaves, making sure that none of them get submerged in the water. If you leave them on there, it's going to turn the water bad. Just use fresh water and keep them around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Make sure that at least the bottom node stays submerged, and a little bit of indirect sunlight is not going to hurt at this point. Within a week, you're going to start to see tiny root nodes forming. Another week after that, and actual roots will start to appear. And once they get going, watch out. Basil roots like crazy. Often, even randomly in the middle of the stem. It's quite something to see actually. Once well rooted, plant up your basil cuttings in a standard organic potting mix. 1 cutting per pot. Again, pre-soak that soil, but this time, do it to prevent transplant shock. You want to do this for these roots that have only ever known living in water. Going into dry soil and then watering later is not ideal. Just as fast as they rooted in water, those roots of the basil plant will take over that whole pot and you know you're on your way. Whether inside or outside, grow your adult basil plants between 70 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit in a well-lit location, fertilizing after every harvest. For me, I don't get too crazy and I definitely don't use any synthetic chemicals on my basil. I simply fertilize after every harvest with a dilute seaweed extract. But really, any of those organic liquid boosts will do. Just don't overdo it. Basil is pretty undemanding. Now that we know the 2 different ways to propagate basil, which one is better? While that may come down to personal preference, speed is often the determining factor when you're making propagation decisions. As luck would have it, I've got some free time on my hands, so let's go ahead and see the timelines of growing basil from seed and from cuttings, side by side. As you can see, in around 3 to 4 weeks, the basil taken from cuttings has grown into a new adult plant. And the basil from seed? Well, it's still a week or two away from even being moved on to a larger pot. In fact, when you break it down, we could have most likely taken a second generation of cuttings from the new basil plants and still easily kept up with the basil growing from seed. So I would say on average, taking your basil from cuttings is at least twice as fast as growing from seed. And now you can see why growing unlimited basil from the basil plant itself is indeed a reality and not some sort of gardening fiction. I know some of you guys out there love basil as much as I do, so hopefully these tips here today set you on the path to a basil utopia. Whew, love this stuff. But whatever happened to that original gifted basil plant that I hacked apart a month and a half ago to start this video? Well, I got a 2-gallon pot, some premium potting mix, and got to work. I removed that store-bought basil plant from its little plastic jail cell and busted up the roots a bit. Planting at the same depth as its original root collar, the whole process took me less than 5 minutes. Over the length of this video, this is what I was left with today. Basil, truly the gift that keeps on giving. Hey, thanks so much for watching, guys. I appreciate the support more than you know. And if you're getting value from these videos, please like and share them to spread the word and help your fellow gardener to grow better.